It's also important to try to tell people out there that just because we need to pay attention for the sake of humanity in terms of what's happening in Gaza, for the sake of humanity, we shouldn't forget Ukraine.
Is it fair to say coverage shifting to a different conflict, which it undeniably has, is harmful for Ukraine?
I don't necessarily think that's the case down the road, Daryl, but I think that there's an immediate challenge. And it's not really that Zelensky said it as much as what he said is very true. And that is after 20 months of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, after that country basically surviving the onslaught overseen by Vladimir Putin, it's still a significant story for those people who are in Ukraine. They're trying to liberate parts of their country from Russian occupiers. They are facing the possibility that Putin can try a second energy war, as he did last winter, to try to freeze them, to break their resistance. They are facing just the day-to-day challenge of keeping basic services going. But then, of course, you have the horrific events which began with Hamas's mass killing of October the 7th in southern Israel and has continued with Israel's mass killing inside Gaza since then. And understandably, because people have limited resources, coverage of Ukraine gets relegated because many media outlets say, well, this is the one story we have to concentrate on. And because many people's attention span are limited or they get fatigued, it's not really possible for many people, I think, to cope with trying to follow two horrific stories at the same time. That's sort of a fact of life, but I think it's also important to try to tell people out there that just because we need to pay attention for the sake of humanity in terms of what's happening in Gaza, for the sake of humanity, we shouldn't forget Ukraine.
And so is that something that we need to have a bit of a reckoning with then, Scott? Is that something we need to be doing differently?
I think in a way that you do it in a couple different ways. I think, for example, on Times Radio, you've got me on to talk about the fact that Ukraine still matters. And I think, a lot of very good journalists out there, very good activists out there, just continue, to keep the facts out there, to say, look, this isn't something that has disappeared. I do think, however, it's probably also the case that for many folks that we need to sort of look down the road in terms of, all right, what are the fundamentals here in terms of not getting led by social media into the sensational, into the hyperbolic, the clickbait. In other words, there will be a lot of disinformation, misinformation to try to manipulate people's attention, and to be aware of that. I mean, I can give you a domestic example as well, Daryl, just to illustrate a point I'm making, if you don't mind me switching to another story you're covering.
Yeah.
You've had, I think, what is a very sensational, hyperbolic statement in the last 24 hours by the Home Secretary, in my opinion, saying something that's very demeaning about the state of being homeless. Many media organizations will cover that today, and I put it to you, the Home Secretary would like that to be covered today. And why is that? Because the story like the COVID inquiry that you were just referring to, maybe people kind of forget about that. It goes to the inside pages. So I'm not saying it's just the Home Secretary. The fact of the matter is, as Vladimir Zelensky did indicate today, people will try to manipulate our attention, to put something in front of our eyes, to keep us distracted from other events. And we should be able to be smart enough to recognize that and cover more than one important story at a time.
He also denied that fighting in Ukraine had reached a stalemate. Let's deal with the reality of that, Scott. Winter has hit, and it is undeniable, is it not, that that counteroffensive in the south has at least stalled?
Well, the counteroffensive in the south has actually taken territory, but it hasn't taken territory in a sudden sweep like it did last year. It's taken a series of villages moving towards the south, but it hasn't reached its main objectives yet. The same is true in the east, where Ukraine is also trying to liberate territory that's been held by the Russians in some cases since 2014. And what happens is again, for the sake of trying to keep people's attention, you kind of want it all to be wrapped up like in one single episode, like a good, crime drama.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen that way. We're talking about what can be a marathon, not a sprint. It's not just a war on the battlefield, where Ukraine's making gradual progress, but still faces a formidable Russian force. It's also a financial and economic conflict, where Ukraine is continuing to show that it can govern and indeed is trying to make the reforms necessary for the really big story coming down the road, which is joining the European Union. Because remember, Vladimir Zelensky, who made that statement today you talked about, who was next to him? The European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen.
Mm.
So I think down the road, you're not only talking about Ukraine moving ahead and gradually liberating territory, you're talking about perhaps one of the biggest political shifts in recent years where Ukraine will become a member of the EU. But that will not happen overnight. So Zelensky's riding away. It is, it's not a complete stalemate. It's not a stalemate, but at the same time, and he has said this as well, it is not something that is going to be a week or a few weeks or even at the end of the year and it's all over. It is something for the long haul that you have to keep your attention on.